My running joke is that the best training for it is to have had teenagers in your household, because you've had people very close to you hate your guts but need you desperately at the same time.
Hi, good morning, or good day. This is Getty Shvekauskas for the weekly podcast of Hudson Valley One. And we have our guest is the former Majority Leader of the Common Council, Rennie Scott-Childress. And I guess the first thing I want to ask you, Rennie, is did you step down or were you pushed?
I stepped down.
That's what I thought.
I did it voluntarily. I've been at it for 4 years, and I wanted to make sure that some other folks on the council had leadership experience. I've seen what Rita's done in lots of different places on the council. She was also the chair of the police committee, subcommittee that we had for a while. And so I thought that she would be a great person to step into that role. And, you know, I think the Democratic Party in general needs to do a better job of recruiting people, preparing people. And so I've got the experience of being majority leader. Rita will have that experience, and will do a great job, I know. And then, you know.
Yeah. Well, I think on most things, she and you are of like mind. Not everything, but a lot of things.
Yeah, we're of similar mind. That's true. Uh-huh.
And I don't know how the new members stand in terms of the issues that you and the others were concerned about, particularly the relationship with the mayor.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's always the fun thing about a new council, is seeing where the chips fall.
Do you have any sense of it at this point?
No, not really.
No? Okay.
You know, and they'll forge their own relationship with the mayor. We're not pushing them in one direction or the other.
Uh-huh. You have 4 new members, right?
4, uh-huh.
Yeah. Do you know any of them well?
I don't know any of them well, but I know them all to some degree.
You have had a chance to. I assume that the existing council members want to kind of train the rookies a little bit. When you have 4 new ones on a group of 9 or 10, counting, you don't have that much tradition. You know, you contrast that with Congress, when people stay 20, 30 years, mm-hmm. and they all know each other, and they know their foibles. And this is a different experience. And I think that the Common Council has, at least in the recent past, often had quite a bit of turnover.
A fair amount of turnover, yeah. It's a lot of work, not much pay. And when you put that together with the fact that most people also have a job, it's a pretty intense experience. And so my running joke is that it's the best training for it is to have had teenagers in your household, because you've had people very close to you hate your guts but need you desperately at the same time. Mm-hmm. And so, you know, but the other thing is that means that the teenagers have moved out of your house by the time you're running you're on the council, so you've got some extra time. It's really hard, you know, to find folks, particularly if they've got children in the house, if they're raising a family, because it really is a large amount of time that we have to put into this.
Well, my experience with teenagers is that they think they know a lot more than they know. Mm-hmm. So that might be a kind of make the process a bit slower.
Well, and we often hear that we know a lot less than we know. That's what people tell us. So there are some similarities there, but you know, it's a very it can be a very trying job too, because you know that any decision you make, some people are going to be happy, some are going to be upset. And so you have to steel yourself for getting the very different reactions any particular decision may have.
And with committee work, it must make it even, that's part of the law that goes with the territory. And when mm-hmm. say the police commission or finance or something, they things that they don't know that much about. Mm-hmm. And they go from being observers to decision makers without that sort of intermediate level of participation.
Well, there's that, and there's also just there's a huge amount of learning that goes into it. So for the new members that came on, I gave them a basic introduction to things like when you show up for Common Council meetings, it's a formal meeting and you need to dress appropriately, or at least that's the expectation. You know, choice is totally up to the individual. But nobody ever told me that when I first got on the council, and I showed up just in jeans and a V-neck sweater, and everybody else was wearing suits and ties and formal wear, you know. So I made sure that they understood all the basic elements. I went through the basic agenda process and how to get things into motion. But that's not written down anywhere, which is what I think we need to do.
As a pioneer in inappropriate dress, I'm not sure that that's the most important element.
Well, you at least want to know that it's a choice,
yes.
Right? So.
Right. Yes, I have been embarrassed many people in my time, unfortunately. Well, you say people have careers. You certainly have a career, don't you? You're, I believe, a professor of history at SUNY New Paltz?
That's correct.
Tell me a little bit about that. What was your dissertation in? What is your specialty?
Well, I study the period of the late 19th century when Americans created what we now call the color race way of thinking about different groups of people. And so my focus is on how we were trying to respond to a whole series of major crises in the 19th century. And those were very confusing for lots of Americans. And so they were looking for a way to try to understand who they were in terms of both themselves, but over against other countries as well. And so they began to develop this concept of there being basically 5 races of people denoted by the colors red, yellow, black, white, and brown. And that's what set in train a lot of the problems that we face today by thinking about people in terms of those color categories. So that's my main focus.
So you think that people from other nations could come here, they kind of need to get trained in racial differentiation and all that prejudice that goes with it?
That's one of the things that happens. There's a wonderful book by a colleague of mine who looked at German immigrants who came to the United States, and they thought of themselves as Germans. But then after being here for a while, they began to understand where power was and who tended to go with whom. And so they began to actually create their own institutions and own approaches toward thinking about black people as black people and so on and so forth. So, and began to adopt then the racial epithets that Americans had. So yeah, that's something that very definitely happens.
As a person of Lithuanian extraction who was born in England and brought up the first 7 years in England, and then came to Frankfort, Kentucky to stay with relatives for a short time, I learned it's really like the 1930s movies, you know, where that servants, for instance, are taken for granted. And it's not upstairs, downstairs. It's a division by color. Yeah, that's really appalling. We still have so much to learn, although we've made some progress.
We've made some progress, but I think there's another way of looking at it, which is that things have actually gotten worse. And that's my concern, actually, politically, is that in the last 20 or 30 years, we've actually begun to harden the lines of color and to think of people very much more in terms of specific color race as opposed to other ways of thinking about people. So when I first went to school, I grew up in North Carolina, and when I first went to school, I went to segregated schools. My first 2 years were all white elementary schools. And we were the first school system in the nation to use busing to achieve racial integration. So for the next 10 years of my schooling, I was in integrated schools, sometimes in white neighborhoods, sometimes in black neighborhoods. So that's what set me up to really think about this in a lot of great detail. And there was a period in the 70s and 80s you may know about that's often called the ethnic revival, where lots of European groups began to define themselves not as white per se, but as Italian American or Greek American or Latvian American or Lithuanian American, right? But in the last few years, those distinctions have disappeared to a great extent, and we've reverted now to, in a lot of ways, to thinking of people almost solely in terms of being black or white or Asian or what have you.
So in that case, the decrease in immigration is negative, because the nationality groups don't kind of refresh themselves. They become Americans, the next generation, and trained in those racial attitudes.
Yes, and trained in those racial attitudes. But I think politically, we've seen that there are certain uses that people can make of these hard color distinctions, left, right, and center. And I'm worried that these distinctions have gotten harder, and they're making our job of trying to create what Martin Luther King called the beloved community. I'm worried that it's making it harder in all kinds of ways for us to actually create that larger sense of belonging that would allow us to develop more equitable institutions.
Yeah, I remember at the age of 8 being in Frankfort, Kentucky, when I went to school there for a month, and the kids were fascinated by these little, my twin brother and myself were fascinated by these little English kids who were uncomfortable in long pants. And they would corner us in the schoolyard and say something in English. And you know, they just thought the accent was very interesting. And you know, later when I became a hippie, and I'm a minority of a different sort, I experienced just the surface part of what prejudice can be. Yeah. Well, how do you apply that to the Kingston community? I think that well, let's, first, let me ask you about the SUNY New Paltz, since you teach there. Don Chandler, the president, has been
Christian.
Has taken a very interesting course in terms of race. That is, I remember when he said that the New Paltz ranked in the 90th percentile in terms of acceptance and in terms of equal performance by different races in terms of school performance, and said, and it seemed, you know, instead of saying we should be congratulating ourselves, he said, that's not good enough. I want to make sure it's 100%. And I thought that was a really interesting take and an interesting attitude, and it's one that he, I think, maintained throughout his tenure, which is still going on. What do you think of all that?
Well, I'm happy to be very much involved in it. I'm actually the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Council, which is made up both of faculty and staffed administration at SUNY New Paltz. And so we've done a huge amount of work. One of the crucial things you may remember was when we did a huge study to determine whether or not a series of buildings were named after slaveholders.
Yes.
And if so, whether they should be changed.
Yes.
And we determined that yes to both cases. And so the names of those buildings are now no longer in honor of former slaveholders. Right. So, and we've done a lot of other things too. We've got a very powerful Black Lives That Matter school contingent at SUNY New Paltz. We've got a lot of professors who are focused on not just this as a classroom discussion, but as an environmental issue, cultural issue, and working hard to find ways to create a community of like-minded folks in terms of, you know, how do we raise everybody up so that we're all functioning and all capable of functioning at our very highest level.
Well, you're a member of two communities, the New Paltz school community and Kingston. And those are two very different places. right, with different different backgrounds, different politics, different a whole bunch of stuff. How do you think that Kingston is doing in terms of the kinds of goals that you espouse?
Well, one of the things that my wife and I really appreciated about Kingston when we first moved here was the long-standing interaction among people of very different backgrounds. Mm-hmm. We came from a place just outside of Washington, D.C. that was majority black. And so when our children were in grade school down there, they sometimes were the only white kids in their classes. Mm-hmm. Because there would be lots of African American kids, a lot of actual African kids, African immigrants in that area, Latino kids, Latinx kids, and kids from Asia. So, it was a very culturally mixed kind of environment. We were concerned moving up to the Hudson River Valley to find something as close as possible. And we recognized very quickly that there were, in fact, a lot of ways that Kingston, the old Kingston, was integrated. Nowhere near perfect, I don't want to suggest that, but there were lots of long-standing relationships that made us feel quite at home when we moved here. Then we've got an interesting thing that's happened where we've now had lots of wealthier, whiter folks moving up from the city who have actually brought some of these problems with them. So I was talking with some police officers, and they said a lot of times when we get these calls about, a person walking while black, it's New York City area codes. Mm-hmm. So, we've definitely got a situation where there's some good foundation here in Kingston going generations back. But then there's questions of how it is that we bring new folks in and make them feel a part of the community and understand some of the elements of the old community. And we see this play out in a lot of ways. So the debate over the Kingstonian, to a great extent, a lot of the people who are on one side of that are newer folks who've moved to Kingston, who had a certain vision of what Kingston is and should be or should remain, whereas a lot of the older folks in Kingston have a very different vision of what should happen here. So, there's a whole series of negotiations that have to go on, a whole series of connections that I think we could do better at making.
Right. Well, the Kingstonian, it can be cut several ways.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And that's certainly one of them. But the new people bring both a level of knowledge work and connection to the economic world that could be useful to Kingston. Mm-hmm. But we don't want that at the cost of their prejudices.
Right, or vice versa.
How do you navigate that?
Well, that's a question. For me, the really important thing when I got on the council was to pay very close attention to longtime Kingstonians, to see very carefully what it is that they value, what they see as the history of Kingston, and how they think about community. So somebody like Steve Shabbat, I've just found absolutely wonderful to talk to because he's got such a long, deep reach here. He used to work in social services, so he really understands the entire social makeup of the community, going back decades. And I worry that some of the newer folks are not concerned about that kind of respect for the older Kingstonians. And then, of course, you can find people in all kinds of different positions and camps and points of view. But in general, I think what we need to do a better job of is bringing people together in some smaller groups so that they can really talk to each other and get to know each other better in such a way that when we do have large, potentially controversial issues to come up, there's more of a foundation for being able to discuss what's at issue, what it is we'd like to see. And that's why I have a lot of hope for this whole rezoning process, because I think a lot of that is going to help us think far in advance about what it is we'd like to see here in Kingston, instead of having these reactions to one-off projects that we often see.
Yeah, when I don't know enough about that difference in the rezoning process, but what I do know, I kind of like. I think it's promising. It makes people think differently. I'm not so sure about the Kingstonian. Also, could be perceived as a class division. That is, people who would like to live there. That is, people with some means, and Kingstonians, when they want to stay in the community, they don't need their big house anymore. The Kingstonian is perfect for them. On the other hand, a lot of the new residents see it as a symbol of, not only new, but old residents see it as a symbol of class division, a symbol of what the Kingston they don't want to have.
Well, and one of the things that I'm concerned with is looking beyond its symbolicness to different groups of people and seeing what is it that it actually delivers. And it seems to me what gets lost is we're looking at adding 140 units of new housing in Kingston, and we've had study after study for decade after decade saying that we need more housing in Kingston at various levels. And so since I've been on the council, we've added a significant number of low-income affordable housing units, mostly through RUPCO.
10%.
We've added that, yep, and plus we saved 2 really big facilities for elderly low-income folks when we approved a pilot to maintain the Yasmin Towers and Governor Clinton, because those were potentially going to be sold on the open market. And if that had happened, we would have lost all that housing for our elderly citizens. But we haven't seen a housing development of this size of the Kingstonian at the more middle level. And so for me, that's the place you start. I know, the original idea was to create more parking, but for me, what's really vital here is the creation of 140 something units of housing, and in a way that is to a great extent environmentally sound, because, and this seems to also get lost in a lot of the discussion, it's urban infill. This is one of the crucial things when you're talking about environmental sustainability. This is what you want to do. You want urban infill. It's close to a major hub of transportation. You can get to New York City without a car by walking 1.5 blocks, 2 blocks down to the bus station. It's also built in such a way. Jeff Speck, who's one of the nation's great advocates for walkability, notes that when you have a parking garage, you don't want it to be exposed. You want it to be interior to a building, because for some reason exposed parking garages just kill walkability. And so you've got a place where people will come, be able to park their cars and then walk without driving around looking for parking spaces and that sort of thing. Plus you've got a built-in clientele for a large number of businesses. I'm aware that the Jordans will make money off of this, but for me, that's part of the calculation, whereas I feel like for some people, that's almost the entire calculation, is that a few people will make some money off the project.
Well, in terms of housing, I think there's a much greater contribution, first from where that motel in the town of Ulster, which is going to be converted for homeless housing, and that's something, a large number of units, 80 something, I think. I'm not quite sure. And then, of course, the county jail area, which is also quite large. And I gather that's likely to have different levels of income.
Yeah, so the new facility that's being proposed out at the old jail site, around 160 units. One of the buildings will be dedicated to senior housing. And it will have different levels of income, but for the most part, they'll all be what the buzzwords are: affordable and workforce housing levels. So that means, aiming at folks who work as secretaries, work as nurses, teachers, so those levels of income. So once we have that, so we've got affordable income that we've been doing pretty well with. We'll have the Kingstonian, which is middle level, and then the old jail site is kind of in between those two levels.
Do you think that the city government can find a way of working with RUPCO better than it has? RUPCO is a really terrific organization, in my view. I think they could work more cooperatively in terms of projects.
I feel like we've always worked very cooperatively, so I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Okay, so you feel that the relationship is positive now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
I do. I mean, if there's news there, let me know.
Yeah. You hear one hears rumblings, but I wouldn't take it to the level of reporting. I think there's always I admire. I admire family, and I admire Rupco as the models of how a community can have institutions that help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. As far as I know, everything is cooperative there. Mm-hmm. Plus we've got the Kingston Housing Authority is redeveloping Stuyvesant Charter, which is a particular sector of its housing stock. KHA is also looking at redeveloping part of its holdings down at Rondout Houses to add more units there. So, we're doing a lot to add units. It's not going to be enough in the end, but it's certainly better than doing nothing. And I think that we actually are pretty proactive, particularly when you consider it's hard to build buildings. It takes a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of effort, So these are long-range projects, and I think the current administration has done a pretty good job of working at these various levels to produce housing.
And then there, individual sites. I always like to see a place that had been let go by a neglectful landlord brought back to life through a not-for-profit rehabilitating it and making it available to community people. Mm-hmm. That's a terrific thing.
So Rupco is doing some of that. We've also got the Kingston Land Bank, which is doing a lot of that now. Yeah. They've done an amazing job. They've gotten up and running in half the time land banks usually get going. They've also been unique in that they've been able to pay the back taxes on the properties that they have taken on so far. Usually land banks don't do that. They will pay a nominal fee to purchase a property. And so because of support from community foundations and other investors, philanthropists rather, in the area, they've been able to do some amazing work at getting going. They've now sold 3 properties, and they've taken on several more that they're developing. So between them, Youth Build, Habitat for Humanity, I think we've got a lot going on here. We also, we are the center of affordable housing in Ulster County, if not the Hudson River Valley in general. Right.
That brings up the whole fair share argument.
Which is, to me, completely bunk. I mean, it's also illegal. A lot of people don't seem to realize that you can't tell people where to live. Yeah. You can't tell them that they can't come here because they're low income, or that runs against federal fair housing laws, as it should.
Yeah, I put in a little advertisement here that I have a columnist named Claudia Ansarge who lives in Energy Square, and she's writing a column now, going to be writing a column regularly. She writes, well, just simply walking around Kingston and writing about what she sees.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
We'll look forward to reading that.
It's good. Now, you have sometimes had complaints about our reporting. We wanted to talk about that at some time, but we never have yet. But what do you have? What reporting have we done that you consider weak or irresponsible?
Getty, I never complain. I raise concerns.
Okay. All right. What could you have concerns about? I mean, I am into complete disclosure and also being willing to mend whatever ways we make what we do better and better.
Well, the 2 areas have to do with coverage of the Common Council and understanding of how it works, and Kingston police related issues. Right. So when it comes to the Common Council, I've talked to Rokos now a couple times, but as far as I know, none of the other members of the council have ever been approached for specific stories or for understanding of how the council works. And this is one of the things that kind of mystifies me, because I have, there are people in the community too who will call or who will be upset about something, but they haven't asked first, what's the process? How does this actually work? And so I always try to tell people the first thing to do is call your council person. We're here. That's what we're here for. We have a phone number that's publicly available. We have our email address. It's publicly available. And so we don't have the scope or the ability to, teach everybody in Kingston how the Common Council works. So that's why it's really important for organizations like yours to be able to explain, okay, here's what goes on with the council, here's the process for doing certain things. And so I worry sometimes that people wait too late in the process to get involved with a particular issue. And so it's just a question of seeing that, we have committees that meet, they discuss particular issues. There's an agenda that comes out every month that says what's going to be discussed. Kingston Citizen is a local organization that's very good at looking at the agenda, seeing what's coming up, being aware of different kinds of issues that they are concerned about, and being on top of those. So it's more a question here of wanting to be in touch with you all so that we can say, here's the process of how a bill becomes law here in Kingston. Here's the different kinds of bills. Here's the kinds of concerns that different legislators may have, so that we can be very open about this process. We often hear this kind of conspiratorial thinking, or, I was just reading yesterday, somebody was wondering how much money is the mayor and the council making from the Kingstonian project, and the answer is zero. We don't get paid to support these kinds of projects, or vice versa. We had people wondering the same thing when we were fighting for the almshouse to be developed by RUPCO. So, most of this is people who are serving on the legislature or in the administration, wanting to do the best for Kingston, not always having all the information we need, because, we're constantly trying to learn as much as possible. And I think that it's difficult to communicate the process in this world because we're so channeled. So there's certain people who read your publication, but they don't read Kingston Citizen, and vice versa. So I can oftentimes tell who's paying attention to the Freeman, who's paying attention to Rise Up Kingston, by the questions that I get and the assumptions that come to us without really engaging in more of a give and take.
Okay, that's I think a fair criticism. Let me kind of put the shoe on the other foot. That I am constantly telling people, don't just go to meetings and report what happens and doesn't happen. Find out about an issue, talk to other people, keep digging, and we realize meeting coverage is important, but it's not as important as it's made out to be. I think that Alan Shartok is always talking about going to meetings, and he had that program at New Paltz, and it just kind of that's dead institutions, and we have an obligation, I think, to try to contact public officials. But I tell you honestly, I could name 5 or 10 public officials whom I've called who haven't called back. Not because they have anything against me, but they just don't do it. So it requires, I think, it requires a little understanding on both sides.
Sure, absolutely.
And I love to build up relationships with individual people in government. Since I do the whole county, I know only a few of the aldermen, but I've had, I think it was one person who I met outside of the Stadium Diner, who said, this was during the first part of the pandemic, he said, you know, this is the first time I've been out to go talk to a person since it happened. So there's a certain isolation that occurs, especially in this time of the pandemic, where, you know, some people wouldn't want to come in to do even what you do here. You know, it does require, I think, a willingness and a desire to kind of explore issues.
I think, well, maybe one thing would be, certainly at the beginning of each new legislature, each new common council, would be to have the president of the council, the majority and minority leaders sit down with you all and say, okay, here's the process we follow. If you've got a new reporter, bring that person in so you can say, here's when the committee meetings happen, here's what happens at the committee meetings, here's what happens at the main council meetings, here's what caucus is as opposed to council meetings. And so you would get a much better sense of where that kind of information can be gotten. Because I agree with you, I get frustrated with some of the coverage about common council meetings, because someone will show up and just say, well, somebody said this, somebody said that, and these people were against it. And you often get much more about why people were against something, even if they were on the losing side.
Well, that's why I like the Democratic caucus much better. I like sitting in the palace.
Well, and that's an important thing to know, because now that we have so many Democrats, and the one he is but isn't a Democrat, Michael Olivieri. I mean, you know, we invited him to caucus with us. But in essence, that's where most of the discussion now happens. You know, we don't have much substantive debate on a lot of issues in the council itself. We do from time to time.
And it's much better in the conference room. People sit at the table. The people observing them are 2 or 3 feet away from them. They see the interaction. They see the dynamics of everything. It's so much. And then compare that to where you have to wear a suit and tie and the rest of it. It's different. That's, you know, the difference. I don't. Was Badgett of the actual and the ceremonial, or whatever the terms were. I like the collegial better as well. You know, the more formal has its place, and we would certainly be doing things very differently if there was a different mix of Republicans and Democrats, or Green Party members, Working Family Party members, what have you, on the council. But at this point, you know, and I think that's something important for a reporter to know, is, you know, caucus is where a lot of the give and take happens, but also committees, there's a lot of give and take there. I'll do that, but let me, you know, would you urge people like the mayor, the new head of the council, and others to participate and to come to things like this, as you are doing now? I'd appreciate it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. On that note of harmony, we'll end the session. Thank you very much for coming, Rennie. Appreciate it.
Sure.